participant list up. There it is. Excellent. Well, good morning, everybody. This is a work session of the Portland City Council.
Recording in progress.
Recording is in progress. Fabulous. This is a work session of the Portland City Council. Today's date is July 27th, 2021. Colleagues, as you're all aware, today's work session is focused on a review and re-envisioning of the city's core patrol services with hundreds of Portlanders, led by the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, sometimes called PCEP for short. For over a year, the committee worked with city bureaus, council offices, community members, neighborhood associations, local businesses, and community-based organizations. I want to thank PCEP, council offices, city bureaus, and the literally hundreds of Portlanders who took the time to learn about the project and submitted their ideas and questions. As we delve into these specific recommendations, and there are several, I want to appreciate that the scope of the recommendations evolved as more and more perspectives were brought into the conversation. We have a lot to cover, so I'd like to turn it over to the co-chairs of the Portland Committee on Community Engaged Policing, Elliot Young and Taji Chismet. Welcome.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler, and good morning to all of the city commissioners and the other staffers who are with us today. First, I want to thank Sam Diaz in the mayor's office, who has been steadfast in his support for the process all the way back to the fall. And then to thank you, Mayor Wheeler, for entrusting PCEP with launching this community engaged process. Although these are recommendations that PCEP unanimously adopted on May 25th, these are not, in fact, just PCEP's recommendations, but rather the result of a lengthy community-led process. So what we're forwarding today are the community's recommendations. Taji will speak in a moment more specifically about how the community was engaged. We also have our data analysts who will help us to analyze the feedback we received from the community. Right now, I want to zoom out for a moment to open this up before we get into the nitty-gritty of the proposals to talk about the broad philosophy that emerged from the community. While it is true there's some community who called for abolishing the police altogether, and there are others who suggested that we needed more police, the vast majority of people who responded, 80 to 90%, were focused on providing alternatives to the police that could both help to promote better community safety and help the police redirect their resources to the functions for which they are best trained, responding to ongoing violence and investigating crime after the fact. In meeting with the staff of all city commissioners, the general feedback we've received thus far is that these recommendations represent common sense. We agree. In fact, while we have been developing the recommendations, City Council has already pushed ahead with some of these ideas, namely limiting police engagement with traffic stops, that was done by PPB, and more vigorously funding community-led programs that will prevent gun violence. We applaud City Council and specifically the commissioners who brought that forward and the PPB for taking these steps. While these recommendations represent, what these recommendations that we're proposing today represent is a broad vision for reimagining community safety. While I'm sure not every commissioner will find each recommendation possible to accomplish in the short term, we encourage you to view this as a blueprint for a new vision. And as all architects know, blueprints will need to be actualized by builders who may need to make modifications depending on supplies and local codes. If you'll allow me to extend this metaphor, the community are the architects of this plan. And we hope to pass the implementation over to the capable hands of Community Safety Director Mike Myers, who will in turn task Bureau staff with building out this vision. So what is the role for city commissioners? You are the ones who will need to provide the financing and give the green light to make this project a reality. What we don't want is for these plans to be filed away on a Google Drive somewhere to collect virtual dust. And to that end, we would like to come back to City Council in September once all of your questions have been answered and to seek formal approval by City Council with a vote. Throughout this process, we have always been promised an up and down vote by City Council, and the community has that expectation. So we feel an obligation to them to make sure commissioners have an opportunity to formally weigh in on these proposals, either individually or in a package. And so today we look forward to sort of being able to start answering your questions and seek a better dialogue about the specifics. I'll turn it over to Taji now, who will speak to the community engagement piece.
Thank you, Elliot, and good morning, commissioners, and thank you so much for having us today. As Elliot mentioned, since the mayor first released his 19-point plan, PSEP has been under the spotlight, and our immediate response was to ensure that we provided space for the community to air their concerns throughout the summer racial justice protests. And undertaking the Core Patrol reimagining process was an unprecedented but important step in the right direction for our city. PSEP rose to the challenge, and today's recommendations exist as the culmination of our tireless efforts towards community-centered public safety. The core functions of policing can and must be malleable with the times we are in as a city, but also as a country. We are learning every day of new ways to augment the work of policing with alternatives that alleviate the already taxing nature of policing. Cities like Denver, who passed sensible reforms that increase accountability and work to train trauma-informed practices for Denver officers, can and must be a model for Portland to follow when instituting these recommendations. So what does community engagement revisioning process look like, and how does PSEP ensure active, widespread engagement from a variety of stakeholders affected by the daily work of PPB? PSEP's entire mission is working to answer those questions. And so this initiative became a model for what future community engagement efforts could be. During the 5-month re-envisioning process, PSEP was able to gather 2 rounds of feedback that Dr. Murray and Dr. Taylor will graciously highlight before our recommendations. We also had 6 work sessions and a dedicated town hall to inspire and build new ideas together on these important recommendations. Our entire reach brought us over 100 participants throughout the work sessions and over 500 pieces of feedback that was analyzed by Dr. Murray and Dr. Taylor's team. In addition to this specific process, over the last 3 years, PSEP has heard from the community in a variety of settings about what they want to see from police reform. And these recommendations work to reflect that community feedback and strive to weave those themes throughout the final report. And so without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Taylor and Dr. Murray to share lightly about our community engagement efforts in detail. Thank you.
Hello, welcome everyone. Good to meet you. And for those who I have already met, good to see you again. Dr. Taylor, do you want to give a quick shout out?
Sure, thank you. Good morning, commissioners. Good morning, Mayor Wheeler. Good morning to those of you we've met. It's so great to be here. Dr. Murray and I worked together on both the map app data and the survey analysis. And it's just been a real pleasure to work with this community. Both of us are very passionate about making communities safer and better for everyone. And so really excited to be here today. Thanks for having us.
All right, I'm going to give a shot at screen sharing, and hopefully my technological skills are adequate. Just to give a super quick mini background, my responsibility here is to talk about the data, which can either be an enlightening experience or a grueling and boring experience. And so I want to do my best to make it neither one of those things. No, I want it to be enlightening. Yeah. I don't want it to be grueling. Yeah. Anyway, on May 5th, we were contracted, as Dr. Taylor had mentioned, to work with the survey data and the map app data. Prior to our involvement, as Taji had mentioned, PSEP had gone through a bunch of different rounds with different community representatives in what I called focus groups, but in town halls and different forums, collecting consensus around a set of recommendations, which is the 13 recommendations that ended up on the survey. This survey basically asked people to rate the 13 different recommendations as either how supportive that you are, either saying you're not supportive at all, very unsupportive, all the way to very supportive. And then in the survey, there was an open-ended question that asked for additional feedback. And then to supplement the survey distribution, the MAP app was available for Portland residents to chime in and offer their feedback as well. And so I'm going to talk about the data from all three of those sources: the quantitative survey, the qualitative open-ended question on the survey, and then the MAP app data. We did have a report that we submitted to PSEP that details what I'm about to talk about in extra detailed fashion. But so this is just going to be an overview. And so I'm hoping that anything that I don't address here, you can ask me at the end or follow up with Dr. Taylor or I later on, and we can get for you. So overall, across the 13 recommendations, there was average support. In some cases, very strong support. I put the top three listed here. Those are the only three that got a rating that we would characterize as being very supportive, like strong endorsement. There was variation around this. And so that we did experience a little bit of a ceiling effect. And this is common whenever you ask people to endorse things that they don't have to do themselves, is that like if they hear the idea, they're going to be supportive of it. There's no like calculation of necessary like risk benefit analysis or anything. It's just how much do I support this idea? That said, we have variation around those averages, which tells a more interesting story that I'll get into in the next slide here. And then in the report, you'll see that we ran some multivariate analyses just to control for multiple group memberships so that we didn't wrongly attribute, let's say, differences by income or residence location or race inappropriately. But they were, because of the sample sizes of those people that represented different racial groups or people who had experienced homelessness or people with disability, those differences, I'm not going to report on them here. You can hit us up about them later. There's sample size concerns basically that make us think that they're kind of anecdotal, not necessarily representative of like the Black community or the Indigenous community in Portland. All right, so those top three are the three that qualified for the very supportive rating. Now, I'm doing that partly because those are the ones with the most ubiquitous support, but also just so I can have a real quick miniature conversation about means or about averages. Sometimes when we talk about averages, at least I know that I do when I'm looking at these all day, every day for my various data analysis projects, that it's important to remember the scale that the thing is rated on in the first place, so that when we see the number, we can calculate, oh, okay, mental calculation, what is that number even supposed to mean? And so I put this little diagram here at the bottom, and this is kind of a rough approximation of how we would interpret different scores. So basically 4 is the middle point representing either ambivalence or neutrality. Anything below a 4, really we're looking at anything that rounds down less than 3.5 and lower is going to be people saying, I don't support this. And then anything that goes above 4.5, we're looking at people supporting this, okay? All right. So here's the rough data. You don't need to get lost in the details if you don't want to, but I invite you to if you like it. The top 3 recommendations, those are the ones that I've isolated at the top with that little bar. Those are the ones that have the most ubiquitous support. Those are the same 3 that were on the list right before. So the city increasing access to addiction and behavioral health resources, or more rapid citywide expansion of the Portland Street Response Program, and increased access to unsheltered and houseless community resources were all like the very strong endorsement. People really rallied behind that. And you can see from the standard deviations that there was not a whole lot of spread around those. So standard deviation, one standard deviation above and one standard deviation below the average will represent roughly 2/3 or 66% of the answers that we got. And that's a statistical thing that we like about standard deviations. It's part of the definition. And so when you can see the low score, see the high score, we're basically saying two-thirds of the sample are somewhere in between 5.74 and 7, right? We know that these are extrapolations because of the standard deviation above the mean. That's just, but we know that the scale ends at 7. So we're looking mostly at that low end, that -1 standard deviation. The next 3 are also up in the 6s. So this is really high agreement, and people are supporting investment into improved police record system, increased transparency on the BOEC calls, protocols, and impact of frequent callers, and a fully funded behavioral health unit. The reason why I separated those out is because if you look at those, that it says SD -1, that's basically the lower end. So people that agreed with that less, you'll see that they're still in the agreement zone, right? So it's closer to neutrality, closer to ambivalence, but even the people at the lower end of the continuum, for the most part, are still in agreement with those 3. After that, everything that's underneath that second, this line right here, everything that's below this, you'll see that the lower end of the continuum, folks are closer to 4. And so that just means that people are more neutral about that. So there's just less conviction being described on these ones from the people that answered this survey. And within those, you got partnerships with community organizations towards restorative justice, expand pilot program to handle larger volume of dispatch calls, invest in police and first responder wellness programs, increase the number of police officers who receive crisis response training, and then create alternative regulatory body for traffic safety, fund Office of Violence Prevention on a permanent basis, and then finally remove private security patrols from public spaces. I highlighted this one because if this would have been 3.44 instead of 3.46, then the lower end of people would have been disagreeing with that. I see a hand up.
Hi, I was wondering if you could just share a couple of sentences on the number of people who participated in the survey, and if we have kind of a sense of the demographic breakdown to some degree, and how you found these people too.
That is an excellent question, and it segues perfectly to my next slide. So I'll just mosey on if that's cool. So here's the exact same information in a little bit more easy on the eye type of graph. These are all the recommendations. They're basically ranked in the order that they were rated in. So the green ones are those ones that everyone says yes to. The blue ones are the ones that everyone says yes to, but they don't fall into that very strong. It's just more of like a medium support. The orange ones are where everyone says we still support this, but the lower end of people are going more towards neutrality. And then that last one, remove private security patrols from public spaces. From that, people on the average still support it, but on the lower end, people are kind of disagreeing with this one. We had about 327 people respond to this survey. So that's the numbers that are in here. Some items are missing data. And so like there's some that have 318, some have 320, that type of deal. There's a really heavy response rate from the Southeast and the Northeast. You can see here, I kind of bolded them, and then North and Southwest being next, and then folks kind of get scattered around after that. So you got those 2 quadrants really supplying the bulk of the answers though. Almost, 55% coming from those 2 quadrants. The majority of folks were cis female, cis male, although 9% did decide not to disclose. The majority were white, about 75% were white, another around 10% chose not to disclose, and then you can see how it kind of tapers down from there. In terms of income, this was a relatively affluent group, and I don't know if this is just characteristic of how well Portland residents are doing, but you can see from the distribution here, almost 20% from over 150K about 20% from 100 to 150K. You got, I think, around 70% of the sample making above 60 grand. So if you look at folks who are making less than 20, that's only 3%, right? So your low income folks are not turning up for the survey. The majority identified as heterosexual or didn't include or didn't answer that question. The majority, 79%, said that they didn't have a disability and had never experienced homelessness. Although there was a proportion of people who said, yes, I've either experienced homelessness in the past or I'm experiencing it now, and yes, I have a disability. So does that kind of give you a snapshot? You're getting a couple of neighborhoods real heavy, a little bit more of an affluent group, a wider group, a straighter group, but there is folks chiming in from different underrepresented groups. Yeah.
I'm struck by the number of respondents who identify as bisexual, queer, lesbian, or gay. I think that's like 20% or something pretty close to that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, as a data analysis guy, I just report the numbers. I feel like this needs to be calibrated in terms of how many people self-identify as those different orientations on average. The reason why we're interested in this data is because it lets us know how well the people who are answering this survey resemble the Portland population. And so if the Portland population has an equivalent number of folks that identify that way, then we're in good shape. And I don't know the numbers on that for Portland.
Let me just respond, Commissioner Mapps, to a question you had about how this survey was circulated, because I think one thing that I want to recognize is this is not a scientific poll that is waiting for population. And I think the results need to be taken as such, that this gives general impressions, but we can't say Portland believes this based on this data. The survey was circulated through city commissioners, sending it out to their listservs. We circulated to our constituents at PSAP on social media, but it's clearly reaching an audience of people who are already interested. And so I think that's a caveat for these responses.
Mayor Wheeler, your hand is up also.
Yeah, I had a question. Did I miss the age data?
No, but
Can I see the data along the age-related data, please, demographics?
I don't recall us having age-related data, but I'd have to.
We did not gather for that on the survey. That was not one of the questions we asked demographic-wise. But I know that there was little to no youth outreach, from my understanding.
Okay. Can I just ask out of curiosity why there was no age data?
It wasn't purposeful at all. I think it was literally a fact of just forgetting to add that information, as some of these we added in at the end, added more demographic info. Initially we just had race and age or gender, and then we added more. But it wasn't for a specific reason. I think we were that was just one we forgot to add. But as Elliot mentioned, it necessarily doesn't reflect the views of one capture of Portland or another. It's more of just a snapshot.
Got it. And the only reason I mentioned that is in polling I've done, and on certain issues, young people and older people have very, very different perspectives on issues. So I was just curious if that was represented here. It sounds like it's not. That's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, age is not. I don't want to get too fancy about the multivariate analysis of variance that we ran on the data, but we did. And if it's a reasonable assumption that income should be highly correlated with age, then even though it would be confounded, we wouldn't be able to extrapolate the age impacts from the income impacts. There was no difference on the level of support that people offered based off of income. So I did look for that to see if there was a difference in means or variance around the mean, looking at income and controlling simultaneously for race and for gender and disability and homelessness and all that stuff. There was a couple of real small differences that came out of that multivariate analysis. And one was that Asians and Indigenous people tended to be way more positive than anybody else. And the group that clicked Middle Eastern, North African was tended to be lower. But both of their agreements, when you look at the mean, was still supportive, right? So it was still above that 4.5 mark. So I don't want to like wrongly characterize these groups. It's just that you know, and you're going to see a little bit. And then I think for gender non-conforming was less supportive than I think cis females were this endorsed that recommendations the strongest. And then if I remember right, homelessness, experience with homelessness, if you had said that you had experienced homelessness, that you were you more strongly endorse the recommendations. But the people that represented some of these groups were like 5 people, right? So that's why I had put that down earlier, that it's more anecdotal. Commissioner Ryan?
Yes, hi, thank you. This is good findings. Is that income based on household or individual?
Oh, that's a good question.
I believe the question was phrased as household income. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah,
That would make more sense. Okay.
yeah.
And then when was the survey? I didn't hear that. The time of when did this take place again?
It was mid-January to mid-February of 2021.
Mid-January to mid-February.
That
Okay.
was the first round. The second round happened at from April to May. Each was around a month open for folks to take input for it. And I'm pretty sure, correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. Murray, but this is an aggregate of all this information, right?
Yeah.
So like, well, because then also the first round wasn't substantive as well, because it was more like about people's opinions on generally Core Patrol and like what sort of changes, and it wasn't as this here is all the second round. The aggregate part is when we get to like the comments people gave.
You just opened up another question, I think. So are they the same people that you went back to in both rounds? And so were there two different sets of questions from mid-January to mid-February, from April to May?
Yeah, the first round was just a question of how do you re-envision, what is your vision for community safety? So it was qualitative responses that we got on the MAP app survey. And from that, we then created these recommendations. And so this data is purely referring to the responses on those recommendations.
In April and May, the quantitative.
Exactly, yes.
Guys, thank you. That answered it.
Commissioner Mapsey.
Sure. Sorry to pester you with all these kind of methodological questions.
No, this is good stuff.
I agree, actually. Do you know the gendered breakdown of your survey group, which I think that you do, and also, do you have a sense of did we get gendered responses? Were men more supportive or less supportive of these than women? I realize once you add in race, it probably gets to be too small to really be able to tease things out.
Not beyond what we would expect by chance.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
There was like I said, I think cis females, they approached that distance where like their distributions were not overlapping, with those who said non-conforming, like that was one of the options, non-conforming gender, and then and there was another group that was listed as other, and cis females were higher than those two subgroups, but you know, those subgroups again only having a few people in them. But yeah, the difference between males and females didn't show up.
All right, interesting. Thank you.
So as as Taj and Elliot had mentioned, these recommendations were distilled from an earlier qualitative data collection and analysis prior to Dr. Taylor and I's involvement. And then once the recommendations were available, they got blasted out again. And then in addition to the kind of surface level, do you support, do you not support, we also had this qualitative data that allowed us to look a little bit deeper into people's ideas and recommendations, and it allowed us to kind of sample the thought clusters of a wider branch of these Portland residents than the initial conversations. So I'm going to talk about the qualitative data from the survey piece, and then I'll pass it along to Dr. Taylor. She analyzed the map app data. I don't want to get too into the technical stuff, but basically there's a really well-known method for deriving a lot. If you've heard of thematic analysis, it's very similar in process to thematic analysis, where you look at individual units of meaning, and then after you've coded for all these individual units of meaning, then you cluster the codes that have similar content together. The difference between a thematic approach and this content analysis approach is really only in the data. A thematic analysis is more appropriate for like narratives, paragraphs, interviews, and content analysis is a preferred method when you're looking at individual statements. It's just the process is essentially the same. The additional benefit of using content analysis is that we create counts for everything. And so we have not just a thematic summary of what people talked about, but we can also enumerate them, which is useful sometimes. You know, well, we're not saying that this is the same thing as like truth with a capital T. This was not handed down in any divine way, but sometimes when you want to know, well, what things are coming up the most or what's coming up the least, that those counts give you at least an estimate of that. All right. So of the survey, the 327 people took, 130 answered that question. Please share any questions, resources, or comments about how to help PSEP review and re-envision the city's core patrol services. I did the same thing that I did before, and I looked to see if people who left comments were different in some special way from the people that didn't. Across income, sexuality, race, and residence, they did not differ. People who had a disability or who had experienced homelessness were more likely to leave a comment. And those who either reported non-conforming gender or didn't disclose their gender also were more likely to post a comment. For the map app data, there was 257 different messages. Like I mentioned, the map app data was longer. The survey data was usually just a few sentences at a time. The map app data was paragraphs. And so if somebody says 2 or 3 or 4 things in their little snippet, then we slice that thing up. It essentially becomes 4 separate occasions or 4 separate meaning units. So from the survey data, we got 327, just a coincidence that it overlaps with the sample, 327 meaning units. And from the map app, we had 793. So I'll just tell you, big picture view from the map app data and the survey qualitative open data, we got similar themes or similar categories, similar clusters of shared meaning. Lots of people gave recommendations on how to improve basically police reform. So saying, okay, the police are here, what can we do to make it better? And then there was a whole separate cadre of recommendations that had to do with non-police things. And that made up the bulk of the qualitative responses. On the survey stuff, the data that I worked with, police reforms were more frequent, whereas in the map app data that Dr. Taylor analyzed, the alternative services to police were more frequent. And that might be because different people were answering through those platforms. We don't have any data to know why the responses were different. But what's important for corroboration purposes is that even if we can quibble about why there's the differences in prioritization, the same things are still showing up. So that's good. That on our end, we like that because it shows consistency across sources. I see Mayor Wheeler's hand up.
Just a question about the qualitative data there. So under survey recommendations, it says need for police, 7%. What does that mean?
Oh, yeah. On this next slide, I'm not paying these folks to preemptively set me up to go to the next slide, but I appreciate that you're doing so.
Oh, sorry, it's just what was in front of me.
Yeah. Well, here's a breakdown so the bubbles are the kind of higher order categories or themes, if you will. Underneath are the individual codes, and I have the numbers. I could read them for you on how often each one of these things shows up in the data. I didn't enumerate them. I did in earlier slides, and everyone there was a small uproar because they're like, God, why is there so many stinking percentages? So I cut the ones off of the individual items. I can tell you though, just anecdotally, that the squares underneath each bubble represent about 70% of the coded content for that bubble. So for need for police, there was a handful of comments that where folks said, listen, the shootings have gone up. This is crazy. There's folks that have said, listen, the population is losing respect. They don't follow the norms of Portland. Like this, somebody needs to crack down. And so because that energy was there, and it didn't fit well into the other categories that I had, I created a separate category for that. 7% is, it's not nearly as prominent of a theme as these other ones, but I did want to give some voice to it. People were concerned about the unreasonable cost of alternative programs, or at least questioning it, saying like, yeah, these programs sound great, but how much is it going to cost? And there are some folks that had said, listen, there are already some of these alternative programs being rolled out in Portland, and we're not seeing any impact from them.
And I don't want to make too much of this. I realize this is a survey, which is different from a poll, but so when you say need for police 7%, does that mean 7% of the responses indicated a need for police, or how do I interpret that 7%? I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, sure. So it's not 7% of 130, it's 7% of 327, because that's how many individual meaning units. Remember, I had mentioned if somebody wrote 4 different ideas in their comment section, that would essentially become 4 different individual meaning units. So these percentages are not supposed to be interpreted like 7% of Portland says this. It's more like of all the content that came out, 7% of the content had that thematic characteristic.
Got it. Because I mean, clearly, from my perspective, where I sit, if you did a poll, the numbers would be very, very different than 7%.
Sure, and but this is at the end of a survey asking about these 13 recommendations. So I'm not sure what poll that you.
So they could have done both, though, right? I mean, somebody could say, "Hey, I support Portland street response that I see here under police funding, but I also believe police need adequate funding." You could do both, right?
Sure.
Either.
As long because it's qualitative, whatever people put in, we have to wrangle it somehow.
I see. Okay, that's helpful, Adam. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I mean, by far, I would want to draw your attention to the recommending police reforms like increased transparency, or an unarmed responder unit, or even training for police officers in de-escalation techniques, or even crisis wellness training for police officers and first responders. I would, like, if you were asking me, I'd say, well, look at the numbers clearly show that this was on people's minds more than stating or reiterating the need for, more police presence on the ground.
I would absolutely hope that people would support all of those things that you just mentioned. So thank you.
Commissioner Mapps?
Sure, I suspect you're going to get here, but when we get to the police funding piece, I'd be interested in hearing you help me think about, we have a bucket that's police funding, but if you look inside the bucket, you have a significant amount of, or it's split between people who want more funding for the police and less funding for the police. I'm looking forward to you expanding upon what the takeaway message there is.
Yeah. And so, my agenda here is just to report what's in the data, right? So like, I'm not trying to sell nothing. If somebody said something, then it's my kind of duty to report how often people said it. And if something came up and it came up so infrequently, then it wouldn't be represented here, right? It's like this, there is a subjective value being placed on the frequency that a thing comes up. Now, frequencies aren't necessarily a true proxy for importance, right? It might just be salience. It might just be whatever people are thinking about right now. And so that thing comes up a lot. That's it's kind of the onus is on this committee and the rest of y'all to decide, okay, well, if these are things that are maybe popular, but these are things that are more crucial. And it's, but I can't make the claim either way. All I can say is that this is content. These are ideas that are surfacing up over and over again to the point where it's showing a clear preference towards certain things. The recommendations for police reforms, and you'll see that there's overlap between the things that came up in the survey and the stuff that came up in the map app data. But I can go through a smaller list. There's more items here, like including body cams, that type of deal. Support for recommendations for alternative services to policing. A lot of times people didn't even clarify. They just said, put funds in something other than police. And so that got a little box there, right? It was like ambiguous. People didn't say it. So I created a code for global or vague or indiscriminate recommendations for funding to go to, or priority to go to non-police solutions. And then mental health services, community police programs, prioritizing homelessness, and implementing crime prevention approaches. These are things that came up a lot. Within police funding, so police funding, right, this is 16% of the number of 327 different individual meaning units. So even then, we're not talking about a lot. I think there was like 50 or so different times where somebody said something about funding. Of those 16 times, or I'm sorry, of the 16% of those 50 times, about 30% of those people said, whatever you spend your money on, at least please keep funding the police to do their job. And then there was some folks that said, listen, the police need more money. The majority didn't go in that direction, right? The majority of folks said, if you're just don't prioritize the police, then it got a little bit stronger, saying, okay, don't cut their funding, but don't increase it. And then it got a little bit stronger, and folks were like, okay, cut their funding. And then some folks were, very radical and were saying like the defund police stuff.
Adam, let me just break in. I'm just concerned about the time because
Sure.
This ends at 11:30. So if we could hopefully wrap this up so we have an hour to present on the recommendations themselves. Thank you.
All right. Well, then I think I'll pass the mic over to Dr. Taylor.
All right, great. Thanks, Dr. Murray. And thanks, Elliot. I'll go through this relatively quickly and you can ask any questions you'd like. In terms of the map app data, this was collected mostly in February, but around mid-January 2021 to the beginning of May 2021, with the bulk, I think around 150 of the 250 collected in February. So just to give you a sense, we don't have any demographic data, but we do have those three main categories that Dr. Murray already went over. And so I wanna do a quick deep dive on those three. So the first of the three categories, alternative services, which had 57% of the content, right? As Dr. Murray has talked about, this isn't people, these are the individual bricks of meaning, basically, were in this main category, alternative services. And so you can see under that, 34% were talking about expanding unarmed community responses and services, which goes well with the recommendations, right? 22% were support for people who are houseless. Again, maps onto the recommendations. Now, this piece around the Portland Street response is a promising start. I want to just dive deeper there because that's the part, kind of the purpose of qualitative data, is to give us a little bit more information. And so what community members said there was that, yes, it's a good solution, but it needs to be fully funded, resourced, and run by the community. A few people cited the Eugene's Cahoots program, which was run by a community-centered, collectively organized healthcare clinic with the trust of the community versus the Fire Bureau. So I just wanted to give a little bit more detail there that, the funding and training needs to be ramped up there while there is support. And then you can see the 13% mental health support. I won't read the rest. You can see them there. We can go back if you'd like. Adam, can you go to the next slide, please? This next big bucket of comments from the community was around police reform. This was about 23% versus the 57% in the alternatives. So here you see the bias in policing. And so earlier, one of the commissioners asked the question around the large percentage of LGBTQ folks in the survey. This was not the survey, this is MapApp data, but the fact that there was a lot of notice around queer bias, in policing, poverty bias in policing, racial bias in policing, that came out as the bias piece came out as the #1 in terms of police reform training to address that. And then more police accountability and training coming in at #2 with 20%, and then demilitarizing the police. There were a lot of comments, especially connected to the protests and demonstrations in Portland. We'll go to the next slide. And here's where the funding decisions comes into play for the MapApp data. So you can see here, this was about 20% of overall, so the funding decisions bucket. And you can see that it's categorized into 3 main categories. #1 is basically redirect funds away. So that's at 56%. And then increasing funds is similar to the survey data with about 34%. I think it was around 30 in the survey data that Dr. Murray presented. And then disband or abolish the police, to Elliot's earlier point, was very low at 11%. So that breaks it out a little bit more in detail in terms of what were some community responses around funding decisions in particular. Any questions for the MapApp data?
Okay, and I think we're going to have, you all will be on hand. So as we go through these recommendations, if there are any questions that come up, we could bring back our data analysts. But thank you very much, Dr. Murray, and let me now share my screen if I can. Okay, I'm having a problem sharing my screen. Taji, could you try it, or is someone?
Yeah, could the clerk do it? Because like I mentioned, I can't really do it on this computer. Could we get the slides pulled up? Or not the slides, the final document. I can also share it in the chat for convenience.
Yeah, if you could share it, that would be great. We actually don't have access to that.
Okay, there's the link. It's just on the PSEP website. Thank you. So if you could scroll down to the first recommendation beyond this preamble stuff. Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to go through, Taji and I are going to tag team. I'm not going to read all of this because you all have been briefed on this, but just getting down to the recommendation part, if you could scroll down a little bit. So this one, Portland Street response, you all, we know, have debated this, have a lot. The community has weighed in. The recommendation that comes from the community is to expand this promising program to the entire city. Now, what we expected based on the PPV's analysis is that they could take 15 to 20% of the calls. Now, we know that that is not happening in Lents right now, and the reasons for that are multiple, but one of the reasons is apparently the Portland Police Association is limiting the number of calls that they are allowing to be directed from BOIC to Portland Street Response. So this is saying, this is a proposal from the community saying that in the creation of this program, a lot of research was done. There's also examples like Cahoots. So we, in some sense, this is a model which has been tried and tested, and that in its current form, because it's just limited to one area and also limited in the number of calls that it's taken, it is can have a limited effect. And we would like to see the availability of this, or the community would like to see the availability of this expanded. And obviously it cannot be expanded, from one day to the next, but over 5 years to think about an expansion citywide. So let me stop there and see if there are questions. Taji, did you want to?
No, go ahead. Commissioner Maps, I saw your hand. I can't see everyone. Do you want to, sorry, Megan is the clerk. Could you, when we're done with each of them, unshare the screen so we could be able to talk about them, unless folks want to see more parts of it?
Commissioner Maps.
Sure. I was wondering if the committee members could expand on what their specific goals for Portland Street Response is. As I watch the public discussion on this, I think depending on the constituency I'm talking to, everyone supports it, but I think they support it for different reasons and have different expectations. And so what specifically is PSEP trying to accomplish or hope to accomplish with this program? Is it to reduce the number of police calls? Is it to reduce the number of violent incidents between the police and houseless folks? Is it to I could go on for 5 minutes.
Right. No, I'll start. So thank you so much, Commissioner Maps. We definitely have strong support for the Portland Street Response and the model that it's currently been working to implement citywide. We are quite aware of their initial plan, which was the March expansion in 2022 with their BOIC special or individual person to take over the calls. We see them as that alternative. Some of the things you mentioned exactly to that point are what we think PSR could do. It really does have the opportunity to augment some of the things that PPB typically would handle, especially considering some of the recent events that have shown the importance of having someone who's qualified and trained to handle folks who are dealing with suicide, mental health crises, whatever that may be. Having someone qualified to handle that is really essential. And the way that PSR has been modeled, not only after Cahoots, but there's cities now across the country who are doing models similar to what Portland and Eugene has really pioneered. And so PSR has this opportunity for further expansion and being able to already prove that they can take some calls over the last 6 months that they've been working in the pilot program. And with the opportunity for further funding, they would have the opportunity to then continue such work. And then that would then alleviate some of the call volume of the PPB. And they also have had consistent efforts to implement long-term evaluations of the program, ensuring that they're doing this very intentionally, as well as the fact that exploring models that are hybrid with PPB involved in some calls is another method that I have heard Robin talk about as something that they want to continue to see if that's a possibility. I know it would be very unprecedented because I know Cahoots doesn't do that, but obviously Portland is not Eugene. We are a completely different city with an entire set of their own problems and own solutions that we can come up with. And I think exploring these new models, especially with an institutionalized program like PSR, would be really beneficial. And I believe that's where PSEP's been standing on the issue for a while.
If I could ask a follow-up question, would you, one of the things we're thinking about internally is what measures do we use to evaluate whether or not this program has been a success? Would you view this as a success if we rolled out PSR, but it didn't have a significant impact on the number of police calls that we got or that we had to send out?
I don't know how that would be a possibility, but considering the fact that by them having the resources to be 24/7, they would be able to handle the calls that they've already shown that they can handle, but just on my coffee, sorry, but on a further level than that. So it would really be it wouldn't, I could not see it deterring calls, or I could not see the volume of calls deterring, because it already has proven that when they do have the resources to be out in the field, I know they've already expanded to their 2 teams, they have been able to take those calls. And unless there was a rapid increase in calls and then the PSR was there and they were all just handling a lot of calls, that would be a different situation. But it is just them trying to take some of the existing volume. And it's obviously going to go down since the height of COVID last summer, presumably.
Mayor Wheeler.
Yeah, I want to chime in on that because Taji, thank you for your comments.
I'm gonna grab a towel. I'm here though.
Sorry about your coffee. It's always a tragedy to lose a good cup of coffee. So I think all of us on this council are certainly supportive of this program that we all helped create back in, 2018, I think at this point. I really see it as having the 3 goals that we agreed on as a council. And I think each of these is a potential win, if I could categorize it that way. The first is to reduce the number of calls that are traditionally responded to by the police, especially where no crime is being committed. That to me was one of the major selling points of this program and one of the reasons I find it easy to get behind. Number 2, to reduce the number of medically non-life threatening 911 calls that are transported to our city hospitals, emergency departments. While that may not be seen as a direct benefit to the city, it is certainly a direct benefit to the community at large, and certainly to our health partners, which are struggling under the weight of COVID and other issues right now. And the third area, which I think is critically important, is just reducing the number of non-emergency calls that are traditionally responded to by the fire bureau as well as the police bureau. And so, our hope and expectation would be that with time, those calls would in fact be reduced. I think we still need to continue to evaluate the 8 performance metrics that are publicly available on the dashboard at the Portland Street Response website. I want to give them a shout out for being transparent about that. Obviously, we want to continue to hear from Robin and her team. I think they're doing a great job putting this program together. Commissioner Mapps has always cautioned us correctly that the Bureau of Emergency Communications needs to continue to be an important and heard partner in this process. And I'd like to find ways, based on not just what I'm hearing from this survey, but what I'm hearing from the community at large and what I'm hearing from my colleagues. Let's find ways to strategically expand the scope of this program and do so as quickly as we can reasonably do. Again, listening to BOA, listening to Robin, listening to her team, listening to the Fire Bureau and others, and making sure that we're not getting ahead of them in terms of our ability to deliver the services. I also want you to know I've asked Seraphy Allen, who is on my staff, to work. She's on the Portland Street Response Work Group, and I want her to work with you on this recommendation because I think it's a good one and an important one, and I want to thank you for it.
Well, thank you, Mayor Wheeler. And Seraphy, as a former student, is a very capable staffer, and I'm encouraged by that. I would just ask you, Mayor Wheeler, and maybe the other commissioners, how we're going to deal with the issue of the Portland Police Association preventing the Portland Street Response from taking calls, because I understand the need to evaluate a program, but on one side, we've got a group that's obstructing them or preventing them from taking calls, which I think is impeding their ability to succeed.
Well, I'm in fragile territory here because this is part of a conversation we're currently having with the Portland Police Association. So there's not a whole lot that I can say outside of that bargaining table right now, but obviously the council's mindful of it. We want to make sure that we have a program that is unencumbered in terms of our ability to respond to those groups that we designed this program to respond to, those who are potentially in crisis on our streets, where an armed officer is not necessarily the right person to be deployed at that time. So we're gonna keep pushing for it.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardesty.
Thank you. It's wonderful to sit back and listen to all this fabulous, positive response from Portland Street Response. I just wanted to add that, as you know, I am 110% committed to fully rolling out Portland Street Response. I think one of the things that I think gets lost in the conversation about Portland Street Response is it is not a program. It is a change, a radical change to our first responder system that hasn't changed in over 100 years. So, I talk about it as the very first change to who responds when you call 911 in a century, in more than a century. So I hope as we continue to talk about the expansion of Portland Street Response, and let me tell you, I'm all over it. It will happen. I have no doubt. As we continue to do that, I just want to be clear. This is not a program. This is not something that, will, be getting grants and that kind of stuff. What we're talking about is fundamentally changing our first responder system so that we can send the right first responder to the right incident at the right time. We don't do that today as often as we'd like to. And so I believe Portland Street Response is part of that feature as we start decoupling who we send to provide aid at the scene. So I appreciate the research on Portland Street Response. But as I look at your recommendations, I'm sorry, I hope I'm not jumping ahead because you did say Portland Street Response, but then you had 5 recommendations under it.
Yeah, we're going to go through each of them, but if you want to mention something now, that's fine.
Well, I just wanted to jump ahead and say that the service coordination team was something that the city of Portland took out of the police bureau's budget because, in fact, it was never really a Portland Police Bureau program. It was, in fact, a Central City Concern program. And so a couple of years ago, I believe, we finally wrote that out of Portland Police Bureau's budget because it was not appropriate for Portland Police Bureau to keep presenting it as their program, when in fact, Portland Police had 2 people working with that program. One was a sworn social worker and one was a sworn officer. All the work that happened with a service coordination team happened through Central City Concern. And so we have to get better at actually acknowledging who does the work in these programs and who just takes people up to the door and drops them off so that people can do the work. So I wanted to make sure that you knew that as a group that program is, in fact, should be appropriately named as a Central City Concern program.
Yes, thank you. And one other thing I would say is that these proposals don't have to be seen as either pro-police or anti-police. What we're doing here is trying to focus the police on certain tasks and take things off of their plate, which they themselves, including Daryl Turner, has said they don't want to be doing, responding to people in mental health crisis. So I think there can be a consensus in this city that the police function needs to be narrowed and that the service coordination team and Portland Street Response and a whole bunch of other things that don't exist yet need to be created as alternatives to step into that place. And that doesn't need to be seen as anti-police. What that is improving community safety. The second issue that came up in our community discussions as we peeled back the layers of this onion is that we were talking about first responders, but there's a whole other problem of where those first responders send people to. And the feedback we've gotten is there just are not enough resources, not enough places to which people can be sent who are experiencing mental health crisis.
Or referred to, yeah.
So there needs to be coordination with the county. I mean, it's a much larger problem than we're even dealing with in these recommendations. But I think this is a first step towards dealing at least with the initial first responder issue.
And one other quick thing I'll say back to Commissioner Hardesty's point around the PSR not being a program, but really an important institutional aspect to the first responder issue is that we've never put the sort of strong barriers on the police around their evaluation efforts as strongly, because we've always just understood it as this program that's in the city for hundreds of years. We've always understood police to do their job, but we've never evaluated them the way we're evaluating PSR. So I want to be very clear that PSR is doing what they're doing without guns, without weapons, and them making mistakes is going to be a part of the process, similar to how PPB and other police bureaus across the country have made mistakes, and that has still not changed their ability to be the first responder program in place. And I don't want to, if there's any other questions on this one, I want to make sure we can get to all the recommendations. So we might go to the next one. And like Elliot was saying, these all interconnect. When we get to the BOIC section, it's very topical around PSR. So definitely not end of discussion in any way. I want to keep going. But I also, Sam did mention that we have, I don't know if we wanted to talk about like each of them and make some sort of final opinion from each commissioner. Is that what needs to have occurred? I don't know how that part's supposed to work. But we could keep going, or if we have to talk, yeah, it might be just good to keep going.
Yeah, so if we could share the screen again and move on to the next recommendation, Taji will lead that discussion.
Sure.
No, I think it's up to the PS3.
It's the mental and behavioral health responses, one right below the last one. This is a pretty, yeah. So this one relates as well to the larger auspice of mental health resources, and relates more to other resources, and something that was alluded to by Elliot with the lack of resources and places to refer folks to when they are in contact with programs like the BHU or like PSR. So the first one is the expansion of access and utilization of a sobering and resource center. We are aware of Unity and what they've done, but there has been a lot of discourse over Unity, as well as just the access utilization of that program is limited. And so this is asking for a super and resource center. And we have just been in the conversations, know that there is potential funding for programs like this through the COVID relief funds that the city got. And so we think that could be a really great place to think about it as well. To the next one, to Commissioner Hardesty's point, it is not something that the PPB is at all in charge of, but we do see the value in this sort of wraparound service. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be the SCT, but something similar to that really worked. And if Central City Concern does still do that, then making sure that they have be able to expand that as it has proven to be important, and also not requiring it to be something that you have to have a police record or report for access to these support systems, as well as also asking for an increase in the number of officers trained in ECIT training. Currently, I don't know exactly how many officers of the 600 patrol officers have ECIT, but there's a lot of value to having training in that. And that can be indicative of really what's happened as well in recent events and how important it should be.
And just a sec, please.
Absolutely, go ahead. Sorry, I can't see hands, so if you raise your hand,
that's okay. I just wanted to ask, your overall premise is we should reduce police encounters with people with mental health issues. And then you recommend that we expand ECIT officers. Could you talk about that? To me, it seems to be a counterpoint.
Sure. So we definitely are advocating for alternative first responders. However, there is going to still be patrol officers, and the more officers who have proper training in de-escalation and handling situations with those experiencing mental health crises, the better, especially considering what's happened recently and shows the necessity of this, because it's still something that PPB is obviously struggling with. And then they're not going anywhere as well. So there has to still be the proper training for them. That's why it's advocated here.
And if the other thing I would add is, if there is a circumstance where someone has a weapon and is brandishing it in a particular way, one would expect that it's likely under certain circumstances the police would be called. We just want those officers to have as much training to de-escalate, because as we saw with the Michael Townsend, who was recently killed, it was a suicide call. And, even though there was a weapon, it seems like there should have been a way to de-escalate that situation. And so the more training, the better, the more alternatives, the better.
If I may follow up, so the question is, shouldn't every police officer have training in de-escalation and how to identify people experiencing mental health issues?
Absolutely.
So my follow-up to that question would be then, if in fact we made part of the training de-escalation and being able to identify people experiencing mental health issues, then we wouldn't actually need a specialty code for police to have that specialty.
The only stipulation I would say to that is we ran into, it's apparently not allowed in the settlement agreement to have all officers under that specific title of ECIT to have that training or something. That was what was mentioned, I think, by Mary Claire. But I wholly agree with what you're saying. It should be that. It should be a model where that training is something required for officers as opposed to the optional nature of it right now.
Well, I appreciate that. And we won't be under the settlement agreement forever.
Yeah, of course.
Is my hope. But,
definitely,
you know, actually planning towards life outside of the settlement agreement is a very positive way for us to be moving forward. So thank you.
Commissioner Ryan.
From your lips to God's ears.
We can only hope, Mary.
I have a clock. Yes, thank you, Elliot. I have a clock watch question. I'm not aware of how many recommendations there are, and I would like to have an opportunity in this public setting to get through all of them and then see if we have questions. So I'm kind of leaning towards a little bit more of a turbo presentation, maybe less editorializing, and just kind of get to the heart of the matter, if that's okay.
Absolutely, yeah.
Great suggestion.
We've only got a little way to go, Commissioner.
Okay, I just don't know what I don't know, so thanks.
Yeah, so we can go to the next one from here if there's no more questions on this, and just keep going from there. Oh, you missed it. You yeah, sorry. One more.
Go back.
Okay, so this one is the PS3s, the public safety. I don't even know what the acronym stands for anymore, but we see this, or the community believe that we should increase the number of these people, employees, to handle low priority calls and to review the calls that are currently handled by them and see where this group of employees can be further utilized. And one of the points that that the community was insistent about is that this group be moved to the Bureau of Fire and Rescue. And the reason for that is simple, that there is no doubt there is distrust in the community between the Portland Police Bureau and the community. And so to create this alternative to the police, it is important for the people interacting with the public to be engaged in or to be under the auspices of a different bureau. So that's this. I saw Commissioner Hardesty's hand, but I think
I did, but I would want to respect Commissioner Ryan and thought I'd let you do the last one and put that out there so that we can have a healthy conversation about these last two.
Okay, so Taji, so let's scroll down to the next one. Oh, Enhanced Service District. I think I was gonna take this one. So if you could scroll down a little bit more. Yeah, so the proposal here is to remove private security from public spaces. The community is concerned about oversight over private security operating in public spaces. I recently had a conversation with Kate Merrill, who is in charge of the East Side program, and she made the point, which is, I think, a good point, that the issue really is not only enhanced service districts, but any business can hire private security officers, and they are operating completely unregulated, armed in public space. And so whether this means more regulation of all private security in the city, or what we're suggesting is that the public safety support specialists or Portland Street Response would actually be the people working on behalf of these enhanced service districts, some way to get public accountability and oversight over these private security is something that I think the businesses would actually benefit from. And if we scroll down to the next one. Okay,
Yeah,
this moves on to a different topic. Should we go through all of them or should we stay within the topic?
Per section, yeah.
I think you should get through all of them because it's 10:45. Yeah.
Yeah, so, and I looked at the rest of them, we can get through them quickly. So for the Office of Violence Prevention, there's also a lot of conversation around this, and we are also aware of the April ordinance that was passed, so some of this stuff ties in with that. The first big part is around OVP needing to reorient their strategic plan for addressing gun violence and looking more at the root causes of it, like employment, education, and housing. And this approach would also allow for the current funding to help out with further permanent funding to be used for, when they're using those grants, they're making sure they're doing it for programs that are not only doing intervention, but as well as actual prevention of violence to occur. And that comes with drafting citywide language to standardize the differences between prevention, intervention, and suppression, and allowing for city council reviews of the agreements between federal employees. We are been in great conversation with, and we'll actually have the FBI special agent tonight, Ramsey, speaking with us. So, and then the final, the other part was, the permanent funding. So that's all for that one.
Okay, scroll down.
So this one as well, the restorative justice program. So PSEP has passed a recommendation, I believe it was last year in May, around restorative justice, asking for more partnership and less silos in the restorative justice efforts of the city and the county, specifically because a lot of public health efforts at the county level do a lot of work in restorative justice as well. And there was dedicated violence prevention teams that worked on stuff and plans made for schools and for programs that the Multnomah County Health Department took on. So this really asks for furthering of that, as well as current efforts that the DA has been making to establish restorative justice programs for low-level offenses and high-level offenses that he's been working on. And so, and as well as the fact that at the state level, they passed restorative justice funding that could be utilized by cities that could be tapped into as well. So all of this is really just an encouragement towards restorative justice, towards programs called diversion programs that have been proved to work amongst youth that could be really beneficial for adult programs, helping folks stay out of prisons, stay out of involving themselves in the carceral state more generally, and is generally beneficial for the community as well. Go on the next one from there. Oh, Elliot, you muted.
There are a series of recommendations here which are under the label of structural changes, and some of this gets a little wonky, but I'm going to just give you the high-level view. What we found, and what the Training Advisory Council and people who are looking at this, trying to get this data on a daily basis, is that there needs to be more transparency with the data that BOIC is producing, and also a coordination between the PPB data and the BOIC data. If you look at public disorder charges, public disorder calls, for one, the data that BOIC produces is completely different than for PPB. And part of that has to do with when PPB shows up, the call might change. But it also has to do with the criteria they're using for this data. So there needs to be standardization so we could actually look at what's going on across bureaus. And then we feel that this data should be publicly available so that people interested in this reform could review and kind of see, as PSR has done with its data, what is going on in terms of the calls that are taken. So if you scroll down to the next one in this bunch, This is where we get into the wonky stuff about particular systems that are recommended. Point 4, the use of force data. So recently the PPB put the data from the crowd control events, the use of force reports up publicly, but we feel that that should be on an ongoing basis. That data should be, and those reports should be publicly available, reports about discipline, et cetera. So just trying to make all of this data publicly available so that the community could be involved in this process of going forward. And if we scroll down to the next one, I think this is the last one. This is the last one, and this is officer wellness. So it's not a surprise to any of you that the Portland police officers have been suffering from low morale, have been overworked, et cetera. We believe it's important to maintain the mental health of the officers in the community. And so there is officer wellness programs. We want to see those increased and funded so that the people on the streets could react in a way that de-escalates rather than increases violence. So that's the end of this. Maybe we could unshare the screen and open it up. And Commissioner Hardesty, I think you were on deck.
Yes, thank you. I was just going to put my hand back up. So I do have a couple of reactions to some of your proposals. Moving the PS3 to fire, to the Portland Fire and Rescue Bureau is not something that I ever thought about at all. Right now, the PS3 program primarily provides support to Portland police officers, primarily clerical support to Portland police. And you spoke of Portland Police Bureau's reputation, but you didn't speak of Portland Fire and Rescue's reputation. What would be damaged at Portland Fire and Rescue and with Portland Street Response if we started having even unarmed police personnel working out of our stations?
That's a very good point. I think the idea is that they would not be police personnel, and that's why the community is very insistent on not calling them officers. So in some sense, what the community is trying to do is see what exists and transform it. And it may be that we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole by doing that with PS3, and that what we really need to do is re-envision that and create, another group. But I think what the community is, we're stuck in the world we're in. And so I think people are trying to imagine a new world at the same time with the sort of instruments that we have now. But I agree with you. I don't think that they should be police officers in the Fire Bureau, but rather employees, maybe a new rebranding that work through. And maybe it shouldn't be the Fire Bureau. This was just one idea the community had.
Well, let me just say that we've asked in the last budget process for an analysis of actually how do PS3 spend their time today? How do they respond to calls? If so, how often? Where? From what I know so far, most of their work has been internal and providing support to police officers within the Bureau. And so I'm looking forward to learning more about how they spend their days before I could even consider where they should be housed and kind of what the next step should be with that. So that was one thing that stood out to me very clearly. I want you to know I share your concerns with the enhanced service districts, but I'm also very mindful about the lack of the city's ability to stop private businesses from hiring private security to patrol their property. I certainly want to know who is armed providing security downtown, and there should be a report to the city on that issue. So I think that is something I personally have always wondered who is patrolling downtown, right? And who do they report to? And how do we make sure that that is transparent and the public has some understanding if something goes wrong? Who do you complain to? And I've heard that complaint a lot with private security. People, there is no process to actually figure out who to complain to get your issue addressed. It is my hope that the work that the Office of Management and Finance is currently doing with Clean and Safe Downtown, as we start renegotiating a new contract with them, that for me, I will say just publicly, I will not support a new proposal that actually buys police officers, because I don't think because you have money, you should have more access to justice. I also would not support a new proposal that provided money for assistant DAs for the same reason. But I'm really open to seeing how these enhanced service districts can support some of the open spaces that we're creating throughout the city, and how that funding could help support the ongoing community gathering spaces. So we're going to be continuing to have that conversation. That contract is up in September, I believe. And so please stay tuned and please weigh in, because it's going to be important that we do this one right and that we have accountability built in. Let me just say, since I still have the mic, this is really incredible work. I'm really grateful to PSEF for the time you spent both engaging community members and also really doing some analysis around how people were thinking at the time you produced this data. I will say that, as you know, over the last 16 months, there have been a lot of different efforts focused on transforming policing in the city of Portland. And I would like to see this work be incorporated in some way into work that other community members have been leading all throughout the summer, right? Nobody has a market on good ideas for transforming police. And so it is my hope that we have a cooperative spirit about taking the best ideas from where they come and figuring out how we collectively as a city continue to keep our promise to the community that we will in fact be transforming our policing so that everyone in our community will feel safe. So again, thank you for your great work. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. And I don't have to tell you that the community has been working on these issues for many, many decades. And the issue, so there's no lack of information of proposals out there. What we want to do is hopefully get the support of City Council to task someone like Mike Myers to actually implement these innovative ideas that we have, that a lot of other community people have. We as volunteers are not able to do that. We don't have the bandwidth, we don't have the power to do that, but you, I believe you do. And Mayor Wheeler?
You're unmuted.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to lower my hand. There it is.
Okay.
So I'm going to go back a ways to where we stopped asking questions. On the Sobering Center, can you give me some indication of where the committee stands on this idea of multiple locations? Did you have specific locations in mind?
No, I wrote that part and I based it on the understanding that there is probably key hot areas in the city that I could ascertain on, but I don't think it would be appropriate to. But I'm sure the BOIC and PBB combined probably could identify those. And I think that there is a value in having them available in multiple areas, if not just putting all the funding into one larger supporting area. Because I feel like there's, drawbacks and benefits to either model, but one way or another, having a resource center and having the access to it for folks without even needing to have been, called by the police, like even be able to go there, walk-ins, is really beneficial and has been mentioned many times across the map app and the survey.
Yeah, so Taji, thanks for that. I want you to know that I think the services provided in sobering are absolutely essential to the community. Just a quick update also, the city's currently working with mental health delivery organizations, first responders, people with lived experience within the system, people from historically underrepresented communities of color, businesses, neighborhood associations, pretty much anybody you can think about to determine the new model for the Sobering Center. As you know, the Sobering Center closed a year-ish ago. And so we're in this new project. It's now called the Behavioral Health Emergency Coordination Network, known in short as Beacon. The city, alongside Care Oregon, contributed $70,000 to Beacon during the last budget. And the goal here is really to create a collaborative hub and spoke network to, with low barriers to care for people who are experiencing crisis or their families, working with law enforcement, care providers, first responders, neighbors, business owners, and others. And ultimately, the goal of this project, as we see it, Taji, is to get people who are experiencing mental health and drug-related crises the help they need as quickly and safely as possible and put them into a supportive setting. There is an idea under consideration that I want you and the public to be aware of, and that's to consider an urgent care style multi-partner triage and assessment unit. That unit would help direct people in crisis to appropriate care. So that may have some bearing on whether it is one facility or multiple locations. In addition, the current thinking is that the network could include existing psychiatric emergency rooms, obviously the Unity Center for Behavioral Health, and we're going to do what we can to create more robust opportunities around detox and sobering options, in investing in peer and culturally responsive services. And I'll be sure that PSEP is connected with Mike Myers and Sarah Fee Allen on my team, who serve on this Beacon coordinating committee. I think there's a lot of alignment between your vision and your goals and the work that's currently being done on Beacon. With regard to the service coordination team, I have been very supportive of SCT. I'm very supportive of your recommendation and stabilized funding for the team from one-time funding to ongoing in my budget back in 2018. That was largely based on the feedback we got from people who had participated in that effort in the community. I'm very interested in the possibility of expanding this to the East Precinct, and I certainly welcome PSEP and all of my colleagues' ideas if this is of interest to them as well. With regard to enhanced crisis intervention team, there are approximately 150 officers who are currently trained. I'm very supportive of your recommendation, and I've worked to increase the amount of officers who could receive the training. So there has been an increase, a bump in the funding to make more officers or make avail that training to more officers. My office will pledge to work with you and continue to work with Portland Police Bureau on this recommendation. And again, if any of my colleagues want to be part of this effort, we would always welcome that partnership. With regard to the behavioral health unit, I'm supportive of your recommendation. And I have actually worked to double the size of this unit within the Portland Police Bureau. My office can continue to work with the Portland Police Bureau on this recommendation. And if any of my colleagues would like to be part of that effort, we welcome them. PS3s, there may be some disagreement on this, but I am supportive of adding more PS3s, public safety support specialists. And people say, well, why don't you call them officers? And the answer is because of labor negotiations. So they are, it's a little bit of a mouthful, but they are public safety support specialists, otherwise known as PS3s. The proposed budget that I put forward included over 30 more PS3s. That was basically a tripling of the size of the program. I think it makes good sense to review this program. It seems like the Community Safety Director, Mike Myers, and his team, the Portland Police Bureau, the Bureau of Emergency Communications, I think they can work together to help conduct this kind of review. Commissioner Hardesty and I talked about this during the budget process, about the importance of that review, and it will happen. I'd also like to hear more from Mike Myers and the Portland Police Bureau and Fire about their the recommendation you've made around where to house PS3s. I have to tell you, I agree with Commissioner Hardesty that I think moving that initiative lock, stock, and barrel to the Fire Bureau, it sounds like a big step. But again, I'd love for Mike Myers and others to have that opportunity to let this recommendation digest, and maybe they'd ultimately support it or have other ideas that get at some of the same issues that you mentioned. I understand that we want the PS3s to be able to work closely with their respective bureau and to have the resources and support they need to succeed. So we'll wait till we get that assessment from Mike. ESDs, I have one response and one question to the suite of recommendations. First of all, the city has allocated partial funding for the Enhanced Service District Coordinator, which is housed within the Office of Management and Finance. The rest of the funding, of course, comes from the service districts. We're coming down to the final interview phases, and my office will forward these recommendations as part of their onboarding. So I want you just to be aware that that process is unfolding. Second of all, maybe this is more of a question. Has PSEP had the opportunity to attend the community listening sessions about the potential downtown clean and safe renewal contract? Have you guys been engaged in that process? Is that something you're aware of?
I'm aware of it. I have not been able to participate in those listening sessions, although we did hear a lot from the community about clean and safe during the crafting of these proposals. And I think, you know, one of the things about ESDs is I think they're not all the same, right? And so the model that I think is the most promising is the one in the east side, which seems to focus on unarmed, helpful, connecting people with services. Clean and safe has been highlighted as the wrong model, and for a variety of different reasons. And so I think, you know, if we're working within the umbrella of the ESDs, there are good models to follow, and hopefully other ESDs could follow that same model.
Yeah, thanks for that, Elliot. And there will be more community listening sessions. And if somebody from PSEP wants to be part of that mix, I'm told they've been very productive and interesting. I can have Contran on my staff reach out to you guys and give you the dates and you can put the word out if somebody from the committee would like to participate in the remaining community listening sessions. I will just say this, as we get into the brass tacks discussions around the downtown clean and safe, one question that will be foremost in my mind is if the clean and safe district is not providing or funding those services, those calls that come in, who will be? And I think we should be aware of the possibility that the current funded positions, and I think it's like 4 police officer positions, or at least it's 4 full-time 24/7 positions. I don't know how many FTE right off the top of my head. But if those are currently funded through Clean and Safe, but if they are not funded through Clean and Safe, I would want to know what that means in terms of who then fills that void.
Well, so our proposal actually suggests that an expanded Portland Street response and perhaps PS3 officers would fill that space. Obviously, the Portland Police Bureau, you know, Portland Police will need to be called in cases of violent altercation. But as Commissioner Hardesty alluded to, the idea that private businesses are able to sort of finance their own security that is actually public security just strikes me as wrong from in a democratic polity. Like, we have a police bureau which is publicly funded. We should have public oversight over them. And if there are issues in the downtown, then we should have police officers dealing with it. But I think the larger question is that the issues that we find in downtown are ones of mental illness, addiction, and it's the same thing that we're trying to solve. Those problems with the police is heading in the wrong direction.
All right, and that's fair, Elliot. You know, I always appreciate your perspective on these things. I just want to make sure there aren't unintended consequences, because sometimes we go through this loop, and what ends up happening is we get right back to the police bureau and armed officers as ultimately being the default position. And I really want us to think about that and have a transparent conversation about it when we have this discussion. I think is it September, Commissioner Hardesty, when this is up for September?
Yeah. Could I interrupt real quick, Mayor Wheeler? I really do think we should have the opportunity to have the clean and safe continue. I've been in those conversations. I was able to attend one of the community listening sessions. And I also am wondering how many clean and safe officers or clean and safe people there are who patrol, how much that would be lost if they were not there. I don't know that. And then last thing is just that we would definitely be willing to continue being in those conversations as they go on in September.
Thanks, Taji. I appreciate it. And Barb R has asked for information on the date. Sam Diaz is here, and I'll have Sam reach out to you, Barb, and we'll make sure you get connected with the dates and the location for those community input sessions. Thank you.
So, Commissioner Rubio, we haven't heard from you. I don't know if you want to take this opportunity to ask us any questions.
Well, a lot of my questions were definitely asked in some situations, but first I'll give you my reflections, which are really I want to first appreciate all of you for your thoughtful work and the deep analysis that it's pretty evident in your recommendations. Many or most of these recommendations feel on the right track to me and in the spirit of transformation that we've been talking about. So I really appreciate the lens and the community-centered direction that this feels like it's heading. I do have a few questions about some things that still aren't clear to me or that I don't have enough information about. So I'm eager to dig in with my team, and I appreciate you meeting with my team beforehand to give us an opportunity to ask questions. And now that we've had the presentation, would love to circle back. But also I want to talk to my colleagues and also have that chance to reconnect with you and follow up. Also, to echo what some of my colleagues have said, I'm very interested in seeing where Mike Meyer's work is going as well and where that overlaps. And then also the Bureau responses to your recommendations as well and the feasibility of them. I think overall, though, the most important takeaway for me here is that there seems to be some recurring areas of work and themes and issues and concerns that continue to surface no matter what table you're at. So that clarity is really validating and helpful to my own thinking and deliberation as we set a direction forward. So I just want to, again, thank you again for holding community at the center and the goals of transformation and safety at the center of these conversations. And definitely eager to circle back on some of my questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Rubio. I see Commissioner Mapps, Commissioner Hardesty, and Commissioner Ryan. Hands are up.
Well, first of all, I want to just thank the city for this great work. You've certainly given us a lot of things to think about, and there are there are initiatives here which I wholeheartedly support without reservation, and some I'd like to think about more deeply. Also, in particular, I want to thank you for your recommendations surrounding BOEC. As the commissioner in charge of BOEC, I very much believe in data and transparency. And one of the promises I can make here today is that my office will work with the Bureau and the folks on your committee to flesh these out and look at how we can implement them. And I see a bunch of other hands up. So with that, I will just turn the floor over to my colleague.
Thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to talk about the Office of Violence Prevention. I think we need to talk about a deep analysis. I'm not sure that office should continue to exist. honestly. And I think we are going to have a much deeper conversation whether or not maybe the county is the most appropriate place to actually be providing grants for youth violence reduction or for violence reduction in general. I want to make sure before we get into the next budget cycle that we as a council take a real deep dive. I've not been happy with that office under 3 mayors, and I'm still not happy with that office. I don't think that office actually engages communities in ways that are really helpful. And so I want to be real clear as far as where I sit right now. I don't even know if that office should exist, but I'll be talking to my colleagues and we'll be doing some analysis as we prepare for the next budget. I'm very troubled by how that office operates at the moment. I will also say that, as you know, I am continuing to work on Portland Street Response, and I am optimistic that we will be continuing to roll Portland Street Response out as the public wants. Those are the only, as I look at your recommendations, I will say I'm interested in the restorative justice program, but that's really more of a a lip sync opportunity than it is a City of Portland opportunity. The Local Public Safety Coordinating Council, I co-chair with Chair Kafori, and we are just starting a transformative justice process that I think you and your volunteers would be very interested in. And I hope some of you are on some of the subcommittees that are being created. There will be a lot of deep community engagement around this transformation. And so I think we will all learn a lot about how to reinvest dollars in community solutions rather than in failed systems that haven't worked. So keep your eyes and ears open for more on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. And we definitely have really strong goals that align around that as well. And I agree with you about the Office of Violence Prevention, and would love to just keep in contact around that topic as well. Thank you. Commissioner Ryan?
Yes, I want to start off to thank this group. Elliot, Taji, your volunteers, correct? Okay, I just think for the record, it's good to remind ourselves of that. This is a lot of work. You have a lot of knowledge, you have a lot of insight, and then you're sharing it to us in a very thoughtful yet pretty dense way at this moment. And I think to, I guess, second what Commissioner Rubio said, I'm in a process of taking this in. It was very easy to receive. Nothing was new. It was just packaged in a way that allows me to think about it differently. I appreciate that immensely. I was trying to connect dots here in real time between the quantitative data where you had findings that were like 6.27 at the top, invest, I think it was in police records, and then going down that list of the top 6 or 7. I was trying to connect the dots of those with your actual recommendations. And I think in real time, I was able to do that, but that will be something I will focus on after this session and well before we come back in September. I did notice that we got there on some. It's towards the end, you called it wonky, but wonky infrastructure is really important. Clearly, the people you talked to thought that, because if I could use your language, that seemed to be some of the top responses that you had were connected to that wonky infrastructure. So I wanted to give some love to such language, if you will. I wanted to also comment on the word beacon, which I think I just found out is spelled B-H-C-E-N. I'm thrilled about that. This is a state, and we have some humility and humble pie in our face right now. This is a state, this is a local, this is a state and a local group, city, county, that over the years has divested in some of infrastructure, whether it's sobering centers, whether you like Damish or not. We had places to take people. And so what I want to be a part of a council, and I know, that won't just keep tearing things apart without providing a solution that actually gets results. So it's easier to react and take something down than it is to actually build something innovative. And so I appreciated when Commissioner Hardesty reminded us that Portland Street Response is not a program. It's absolutely transformational reform about how we do first response. All of us know we need to improve upon that. We are having great dialogue to figure out how to land that. And but I wanted to put just some emphasis on the fact that we have some humble pie about closing sobering centers when we needed more, for example. And so these are the challenges that we're facing as we go forward. And I think it's important to keep telling that truth so that we don't think that we just got here overnight. We did not get here overnight. We have had failed leadership for decades in this state when it comes to mental health and behavioral health, or we wouldn't be anywhere from 47 to 51st in the country. We can only blame President Reagan so long on this one. It's like our state and our city has to respond, not just with compassion, but with results. And so I am just really trying to connect the dots as I listen to this presentation to get to these root causes. I know my colleagues are too, but I just want to thank you for your time. And I want to use this as an opportunity to be bold and to also be thoughtful and to accept that we can get results methodically, but we cannot keep tearing things down without having plan B. Thanks.
Well, that's exactly, I think, what our proposals are doing, is trying to build up these alternatives. So it's very helpful to hear. Mayor Wheeler?
Yeah, just a quick point here. So I agree pretty much with everything Commissioner Ryan just said. You know, this is a turning point. I actually feel really good about this council and the work that we're doing with our state and our county partners to try to reestablish mental health infrastructure that really has been systematically defunded and dismantled over a period of decades. And it's a tall order, and it's obviously not going to help come quickly, but there's been some good efforts over the years. The Crisis Assessment and Treatment Center back in 2007, the Unity Center, some of the work that our nonprofit partners have done, some of the collaborations with the healthcare providers that they've tried to put together. But we're starting to see a real turn in the tide with not only how we approach mental health, but also how we talk about it as a community, as a society. The decision to close the sobering center wasn't really a decision. What happened there, the sobering center had always been there. It had always been supported throughout many budgets. What happened was the people providing the service had to ultimately acknowledge that the people coming into the sobering center had far more significant issues than they could handle under that construct of what a sobering center was. And so they did not feel that they could guarantee either the safety of their employees or the people who were in the sobering center. And so they made a difficult decision to close the sobering center. And that's where we all agreed, hey, we need to get together again, create this beacon process and find ways that we can serve the current needs of the community. Just one last point on mental health. Simone Biles is my new hero because she has done this amazing thing to really highlight for everybody and mainstream issues of mental health and the connections between mental health and physical health and the ability to do the things we all need to do on a daily basis in our community. So I actually think our timing is good here. I think there's about to be this global reckoning around the importance of being open and honest about mental health and being clear-eyed in terms of our assessments of what the impacts of failure to address mental health issues are on our communities and on our society. And the work that you are trying to do on PSEP by acknowledging the importance of these issues, I think is front and center in terms of innovating and helping us lead into the future. So I just want to say I'm part of the Amen choir here. Thank you. And Commissioner Ryan, thank you for your thoughtful words. I believe this council stands united in our desire to do much better around acknowledging and addressing the mental health crisis in our community.
Thank you, Mayor Wheeler. And this is the time when we want to make an ask of you, which is seems to be general support for these proposals. There are some questions about individual ones. And what I said at the outset is what we don't want this to remain is a vague recommendations that people sort of continue to think about and ruminate on, and nothing gets done. And so we would like to come back in September after having your staff speak with us and sort of work through some of the details so that we could actually have the city council put their seal of approval on either a subset of these recommendations or amended recommendations, and give the task to someone like Mike Myers to implement it, because you cannot, I mean, frankly, Taji and I have been spending 15 to 20 hours a week doing this as volunteers, and we cannot continue to do that. So we feel like we've done our part in coming up with these recommendations. We're willing to continue to help, but it's really going to require staff time of each of the commissioners who are responsible for particular bureaus, as well as someone like Mike Myers who can sort of oversee the whole thing to move this forward. So Mayor Wheeler and then Commissioner
Yeah,
Hardest.
I'll be brief. I just want to say yes, we will commit to that. I will assign Sam Diaz for my staff to reach out and work with you and continue to work with all of our council offices to move these recommendations forward.
Thank you. Commissioner Hardest.
There are 2 or 3 recommendations that I support and would be happy to move forward with a council vote. Some of them require much more work before you could gain my support. And some of them I don't support, like moving the PS3s to fire and rescue. And so I'm happy, and as always, to be very clear about where you have my support and where you don't. And I'm very happy to work with you to move those forward that I support, or that you convince me I should support. Either way, I want to be honest. I don't think all of these proposals are ready to move forward for a vote. I would not want to overload Mike Myers, who's already overloaded because we throw everything first responder related to him. So I want to be really thoughtful about what we give Mike Myers to do, that we collectively decide what is the most pressing, or what are the things that we think we're most likely to be able to get done over the next year. I'm very happy to have that conversation, but I just want to be honest that there are some things I support, some I don't. So I don't think the package can move forward unless you get all my other 4 colleagues to support everything as it is. But there are parts that I'm absolutely willing to support and advocate for.
Thank you.
Real quickly, before Commissioner Mapps, I think that we'll definitely have the opportunity in the time that from now until we actually vote on anything, not only to make amendments and changes, but also I don't think all of them necessarily need a vote. Some of them are more of like, how do you already improve an existing strategic plan of a set bureau? Some of them do actually have like funding stipulations or ordinance-based language to them. So that's definitely an agreement there, Commissioner Hardesty.
I appreciate that. And just so you know, we're used to people giving us reports. We're not used to voting on reports other than to accept them. You're asking us to do something different, is to make policy decisions based on a report that you're giving to us, right? So that's why I want to be very clear. I mean, normally it's easy for us to vote yes, because we're just accepting the report. We're not saying we're going to do anything with it, just that we're accepting the fact that people did the work. And so what you're asking us for is something different. And I just want to acknowledge that and say that you may get some of what you want, but you probably won't get all of what you have moved forward.
Yeah, and that's precisely the distinction that we're interested in. We don't expect everyone to agree on everything. And thank you for the support that you have offered. Commissioner Mapps.
I just want to thank you for all of this really thought-provoking work, and I want to reassure you that my office will work with you to spark a conversation about the BOIC reforms in particular.
Thank you, Commissioner Maps. So I think we're at the close to the end of our time here. Taji, are there any final words you want to add?
No, I have a lot of thoughts, but I feel like the main thing we did speak with Mike Myers prior to this. He had, and I agree with you, Commissioner Hardesty, he has a lot on his plate, but he did say there's certain ones that are very tied to what he's already doing, and then other ones that make more sense for different bureau staff to take on. And that's really what I'm feeling and think it would be best to do. And think this has been great. And thank you all so much for taking the time out of your day. And really hope you all enjoy some time off in August if all of you are headed out.
And I just want to thank all of you also for taking the time, but to reiterate that the gist of the community feedback we've gotten over these few months and over 3 years is that there is an urgent need for a radical transformation of the way we do community safety in Portland. And I just can't underline that enough. Yes, we need data. Yes, we need to do this right, but people are dying on the street right now, have been dying, and yesterday is already too late. And so if you get any message from our presentation today, I hope it is that what Portlanders want and need is urgent action, concerted effort from our political leadership to make these things happen and to cut out the red tape and the bureaucracy, which you and I and all Portlanders are frustrated by. There's too much at stake right now to have us be hampered by bureaucratic inertia. So thank you, and I look forward to moving forward.
All right, well, thank you for this great presentation, and colleagues for the provocative discussion. There's a lot to work with here, and I want to acknowledge that you said that there are members, you and members of your committee are spending as much as 20 hours per week volunteering on this effort. I want to acknowledge that and just say this is a heroic effort on your part, and we're really grateful for it. Thank you so much, colleagues. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who tuned in. We are adjourned.
Thank you.